We are grateful to Commissioner Gomez for her remarks. Thanks to all of you joining us here in person and online for the grand finale of our IP transition workshop. We're thrilled to have everyone's undivided attention with no major sporting events happening right in the middle of our panels. We're also very thankful to our esteemed group of panelists who have agreed to join us here today. Let me introduce them really quickly. We have Douglas Meredith, an economic advisor with telecom consulting firm JSI in Greenbelt, Maryland. We have Nick Rogness, CEO of Golden West Telecommunications in Wall, South Dakota. Jeff Dupree, VP of Government Relations for the National Exchange Carrier Association, a membership association of local telecom companies. NECA provides access, charge, tariff, and pooling administration and is headquartered in Morristown, New Jersey, but I think most of you probably knew that. Last but not least, we have Jonathan Chambers, who is CEO of Conexon Connect, which is based in Kansas City, Missouri. And I'm Scott Lively with the FCC's Wireline Competition Bureau. So for the past couple of days, we have heard several panel discussions about the costs and benefits of the IP transition and the challenges of making an expedient transition while safeguarding universal service. Issues raised include the government's role in IP interconnection, how to ensure reliable access to 911 and protect accessibility, and also how to reform and potentially phase out certain existing mechanisms. Now we turn our attention to the high-cost USF program and the mechanisms that provide substantial funding for network deployment and operations. Are those mechanisms and that funding aligned with the goal of facilitating the IP transition? Ultimately, the question before us this afternoon is how can we ensure that the high-cost fund is facilitating the IP transition in a way that achieves the Commission's universal service goals? So with that, we will dive in with some questions. Over the next hour, we're going to really dig into some specifics. Let's begin with just a few thoughts from each of you on how you see the IP transition impacting the overall goal of universal service. Again, how you see the IP transition impacting the overall goal of universal service, that goal being to ensure robust, affordable voice and broadband service are available to Americans throughout the nation. You do not have to limit your comments to just the high cost fund if you don't want to. It's perfectly fine if your answer begins with, "It depends." Doug, you're first in line here. Why don't we begin with you?
Thank you very much, Scott and AJ, for having me. It's an honor to be here with my colleagues. Stephen Covey, a prominent management consultant, is attributed to have said, "The main thing is to keep the main thing." And in this space, inter-carrier compensation reform or ICC or IP reform, universal service reform, I think universal service is really the main thing. And so I'm glad that we have this panel and this session to talk about it. Chairman Carr talked about corner cases. And as an economist, corner cases require corner solutions. And rural service is one example of a corner case. And universal service funding is the corresponding example of a corner solution. Without universal service funding and support for the majority of the area of the United States served by rural carriers, the universal service or the objective of having networks deployed in these areas capable of providing voice and broadband services would not come to pass. We would have large gaps in the country. And so I applaud the Commission's long-term foresight in promoting universal service and making sure that there's adequate support for cost recovery in areas that are very hard to serve, high cost, and low density. And ICC reform, IP reform, and universal service, in my mind, are integral to the effort of moving to this new framework, this new IP framework. And with that, I'll stop and let others talk, and I'll have more to talk about later.
Thank you, Doug. Nick, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So I thought it'd be helpful maybe to start by just defining what we mean by rural. I represent Golden West Telecommunications. We're a rural company in the great state of South Dakota. To give you a perspective, our service territory covers the size of Maryland, Delaware, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts combined, with an average customer per mile of just over 2. So our average community is about 700 members. And so from a rural standpoint, my comments are framed around that context. And we're not unusual from a rural standpoint. And in fact, I think NTCA's members average a little bit closer to 7 customers per mile, but it is expensive. And this concept of just pass it on to the end users, what end users? In a lot of cases, the cost of the network far outpaces the ability for rural consumers to absorb those costs. And so this concept about affordability and its tie towards universal service is intimately tied. The Telecom Act of 96, Section 254, states that rural consumers should have access to reasonably comparable services in urban areas in terms of quality and rates. And I think from an IP transition standpoint, making sure that rural companies have the right level of predictability, don't incur new costs that are already very difficult to manage, that ultimately get passed on to end users as an affordability. And most importantly, we're on the edge of the network. So it's very difficult for us to deliver traffic to Chicago when you're thousands of miles away and you're on the edge of the network. So I think those are the core issues. And if it's, I'll say, not navigated appropriately, I think at times the rural consumers will be negatively impacted if we don't figure out a way as an industry as a whole to navigate so that we don't create this David and Goliath scenario between rural providers and large providers. So it's a very important concept because, as Douglas said, without universal service, rural telecom wouldn't work, period. I'll have more to comment later.
Thank you, Nick. Jeff.
Thank you, and thanks for having me on the panel. Just quick clarification, as Scott indicated, everybody should know what NECA does. Well, I'm pretty sure not many people in the room knows what NECA does. We support more than 1,000 rural incumbent local exchange carriers, and has helped them implement FCC communications policy for over 40 years. Through industry-wide tariffing, predictable cost recovery, revenue distribution, pooling, regulatory compliance, and critical data administration, we've helped rural carriers serve high-cost areas and provide economies of scope and scale that these smaller providers don't have on their own. Much like what Nick was indicating before, very small entities don't have the same economies of scope and scale to build out their networks, to go to the whole IP transition, dependent very heavily on universal service support. NECA is definitely interested in seeing that their member companies are well treated as this moves forward. NECA has also worked closely with FCC staff over those 40 years to help implement their goals of universal connectivity, accountability, efficient policy and implementation. Just want to mention that we will continue as diligently as possible to assist the Commission as they're moving forward to implement their goals in these proceedings, the multiple proceedings that are underway, and trying to make sure that the rural members of NECA, the RLECs, the rural local exchange carriers, are well treated and able to continue to provide the excellent support they've provided over 40 years. Thank you.
Jonathan.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks to my other panelists. It's good to be back. I haven't been in this building, left the FCC a little over a decade ago, and I think I came back once in that time. I haven't been engaged in the IP transition since I was here, and I'm not engaged in the IP transition now. So I recognize my role sometimes is like skunk at the garden party. There's no reason for anybody to know what I've been doing the last 10 years, so as quickly as I can. After I left the FCC, I joined a fellow named Randy Clint, who was at a rural electric cooperative. We've spent the last 10 years working with rural electric cooperatives, building fiber optic networks, always in rural America, by definition. I think I'd agree a lot of what Nick said. Our population density where we build is more like 5 to 10 locations per mile. Tough to get down to 2. Tough to build fiber down to 2, but we have shown that you can profitably build fiber optic networks between 5 and 10 homes per mile, even without government subsidies, although we have been a participant in every funding program that has been a competitive funding program, the CAF2 auction, the RDOF auction, CARES Act, run by other agencies as well, Reconnect, CARES Act, BEAD, the various ARPA programs, and again, agree with what Nick said. It is essential. I think there's no question about it, not just what my colleagues and I back in the early 90s wrote in what became the 96 Telecom Act, the Universal Service Provisions, it is essential that funding be made available in areas where you could not otherwise not afford to deliver, in this day and age, high-quality broadband to rural consumers. And so I'll make one little comment, and we can come back to it. As far as the IP transition, and the question posed to us was, what effects does the IP transition have on the Commission's goal of universal service? My judgment after all these years that it is a sort of a net, small, detrimental effect on universal service. I think the way the IP transition proceedings have rolled out over the years have strayed a little bit from their original purpose. The old thing where if you start in Los Angeles and you're driving to New York, if you're off by 1% or 2%, 1 degree, 2 degrees, you end up in Cuba. I think the Commission has strayed from a couple of fundamental principles, those that were laid out by Congress, both in 1996 and in 1993 in the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, and also in 1992 in the Cable Competition and Consumer Protection Act, whatever we called it. Strayed in two ways. One, and then I'll shut up. One, it has not been technologically neutral. Everybody talks about technologically neutral, but most of the Commission's policies are technology accommodating, not neutral. I would say the same thing about NTIA and Department of Agriculture and everybody else. And the second thing is they haven't been competitively neutral. You can't be competitively neutral if you only have one player. There are times in which there is only one player. And when you identify there's only one player, as there is probably in nearly all, but I'd say all of NIC's territory, then you have to have policies directed to that one player. When I was here, people would tell me, look, you can't open up everything in competition. What if nobody shows up? What if nobody shows up? And as the Commission demonstrated through fantastic work in the CAF2 auction, RDOF auction, I know they get criticized. Folks show up. Gigabit bids in whatever it was, 90% of the country. Folks show up. Communities. I work with rural electric cooperatives. Rural electric cooperatives show up. They don't exist in 100% of the company. So sometimes you'll have to have special proceedings, as the Commission does. But I think we have to get back to basics. And I think the IP transition, and if I were king, I'd terminate all the proceedings.
Thank you, Jonathan. We are glad you're here. That goes for all of our panelists. Jonathan raises the point that not all of high-cost USF is up for competition, and he is indicating perhaps that is detrimental to the IP transition. We would welcome any other views on that. Please dive in. Doug, Nick.
Sure. Yeah. The technical or neutrality issue I'll set aside. I want to really focus on the competition response, because competition is an integral part of the development of the modeling frameworks and so forth. And also competition drives a policy decision as to how much support should be given and shouldn't be given in the programs. I'd like to submit a proposition. A proposition is that the existence of competition of broadband services informs public policy, but there's two caveats to that. First of all, caution's really needed to determine the presence of actual competitive presence. The existence of competitive broadband, for example, is not a guarantee of the existence of affordable voice service. And the FCC's broadband data collection is a good example. We have really good data now at the location level for broadband. We have very poor data on the availability of voice for that, standalone voice services in that area. I know the Broadband Data Act doesn't really talk about voice, but it would be really great, I think, for the FCC to have voice data at the location level as well. The shortcut that's being taken now, saying if a competitor offers voice anywhere in the state, it's assumed that they're offering voice throughout the state, is a shortcut, and it is not really getting to the proposition. The second caveat is to note, and I know, AJ, you're really integrated into this competition stuff, but the universal service is bounded both by availability and affordability. And competitive offerings for service in high-cost areas may suggest the removal of obligations, for example, of guaranteed affordable service. This comes at a peril to the end users. A competitive provider who is not bound by affordability considerations, they're not bound by it because they don't have an obligation to actually offer services at affordable levels. And without universal assurance that affordable service is required, there's a potential for market failure, where there's actually only one provider offering service because there's no other providers that are in that area. And once that is established, then the one provider can charge whatever they want. And we have some good examples. I think one really glaring example that I want to just note is what we talked about yesterday. In the 911 panel, we had a couple of comments on the BDS service availability of TDM circuits for 911. And the experience that with the removal of ex-ante price regulation on those circuits, because there was presumed to be competition in that area, the circuit prices have gone up, orders of magnitude up. And so the 911 panel and other rural voices have observed this behavior, that if you don't have price guarantees or assurances that a provider is there at the ready to provide service at an affordable rate, then all bets are off and users will bear the brunt of that. Competitive policy, while important, has constraints and it needs to be bounded. It isn't just saying, oh, there's somebody there, so we don't have to worry about it, because there are other considerations that need to be taken into account.
Nick or Jeff, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think just leaning back to prior comments about, look, there's a reason why things like CAF ICC are in place. It's because it's difficult to get, I'll say, outside entities to come and invest in rural America. It's just that the economics make it very challenging to do. Jonathan mentioned 7. In a lot of cases, you don't have a solid business case to make that work. So if you have competitive entrants in there, great. The biggest question is, well, how does that impact rates, though? At the end of it, you only have a fixed number of people in a location, and the densities work against you from a math standpoint. So you either raise rates, or even worse, when you have a lot of competition going on, what ends up happening is you got the same network costs that are there spread across a very thin set of users. So back to the point of just things like CAF ICC, these other programs, enhanced ACAM, high-cost loop support, things like that, they make rural telecom work. And until such time as somebody can figure out exactly how to bring a lot of competition to rural areas and do it economically that doesn't disadvantage rural Americans on affordability, I think kind of circular argument, back to what Douglas said. I do think there's room for competition. There is competition in rural America, but it's also a distinct challenge that doesn't exist anywhere else in the United States from just a geographic and economic standpoint.
Just a quick comment, because I think we're ready to move on, but because I echo a lot with what Nick was just saying, is the thing to just point out is for most of the areas that the companies that are members of NECA and represented by others on the panel here, most of the time the incumbent was there first. The incumbent was there to have to provide service and was obligated by statutes to provide service. Competition usually doesn't exist right off, and there had to be service to be starting from before you could have competition for that service. Just an aside to what Nick was just talking about.
Thank you, Jeff. Before we do move on, Jonathan, you have anything else?
I'll be quick. Over the last 10 years, again, my company alone has designed and built hundreds of thousands of fiber miles in rural America, only rural America. Investors alongside me and my partner have invested billions of dollars in rural America. We do so where we compete with subsidized carriers. Again, it was the same thing I heard when I was here. Nobody will do it. Nobody will compete. Nobody will be there. Not until you try. And today, if again, we don't want to talk about the elephant in the room, I'm unaware of where voice service is unavailable anywhere in the country. I would not impose a requirement that there be a conversion from TDM switched voice services to IP, some version of IP, VoIP, interconnected VoIP. I wouldn't. It's just not right to say that there's no competition for voice, that there's no competition for broadband. We're all going to sit here and say SpaceX is not broadband. I don't think SpaceX is broadband. That's not the Commission's position. That's not NTIA's position. That's not the position of all the state broadband offices. We take that position. It's all internally contradictory. Again, shut up, but You can't say there isn't already competition. You can't say there isn't already multiple providers of voice services all across the country. You can't say it. The Commission's data shows it, at least what the Commission says. Now, it comes down partly to definitions. I could define broadband in a way that there is one provider, no providers in lots of parts of the country. I can also define where there's 3 and 4 providers, 5 providers everywhere in the country. It all depends on how you're defining it. It's like a buddy of mine told me once when we were parents of Little League baseball player or travel team baseball players. He said, our team could be undefeated. It just depends on who you pick to play against. You could have broadband everywhere. I think the broadband definitions of the FCC don't take into account that they should be defining for the future. Anybody tells me that 15 years from now, the length of time of enhanced ACAM, and then 15 years from now, 100 down, 20 up is going to be broadband. I don't even offer a service that slow. So there is voice competition. There is broadband competition. It may not be the type that the Commission wants, but then the Commission should define it. And the Commission hasn't done so. Right now, the way the Commission defines things, there is voice and broadband competition everywhere. I would let everybody play out their string. I have subsidies, you have subsidies, play it out. But until things get redefined as to the definition of broadband, again, I don't see the point. I don't see the point in just claiming there's no competition. The Commission is a great institution. I've worked here. I've been in oversight capacity. I've lobbied here. It's a great institution. It has a great job ahead of it. But the first thing, whatever your point was earlier, the first thing should be the first thing, or the main thing should be the main thing. To me, the first thing is definitions. What do you all think broadband should be defined at?
I think, Jonathan, the concept for universal service really should be based on networks. We're talking about funding networks that are capable of providing broadband and voice.
That was a little thing we did here. Changed the definition. We said we want to fund, there are plenty of people here who were back then with me. We said we want to fund broadband. Oh my God, we don't have the authority to fund broadband because telecommunications is the only thing we can fund. And information services, we can't fund that. We're going to have to find a way around it. Oh, here's our way around it. We're going to fund networks capable of delivery of broadband and voice services. It's just a little trick, the FCC. So sure, fund networks. Maybe. Fund homes. Fund people. Fund communities. Not networks.
Let's talk voice for just a few minutes. And I think every panel thus far has talked about voice because that's such a huge piece of this. How do we, if we're going to facilitate this IP transition, how do we make sure that everyone has reliable voice with 911 access and so forth? So currently, as we know, voice telephony service is the telecom service funded by USF mechanisms, and ETC must offer voice telephony to receive federal USF support per the Commission's rules. The service must be capable of providing, quote, voice-grade access to the public switch network or its functional equivalent, minutes of use for local service provided at no additional charge to end users, access to emergency services, and toll limitation services to qualifying low-income consumers. How should we be looking at this voice requirement for high cost if we're going to facilitate the IP transition and safeguard universal voice access? Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, standalone voice requires access to the public switch telephone network or the ability to send and receive calls to other people on the networks, all the communities that Jonathan's talking about. And so the voice services is very important as a requirement for universal service. It's right there in 54101, as you described it, Scott. So standalone voice is very important because you don't want to have a situation where you have a competitor or a provider saying, oh, I'll give you voice at an affordable rate, but you have to buy X and Y and Z before you can get to it. And so any broadband capable network, if you're saying, okay, broadband's the key, that's the marquee service, and we're going to be using broadband as the litmus test, you have to buy broadband before you can buy voice as an application on top of it. And so you're compounding the charges to the end user, and the end user may not want that broadband service. They may be just fine. There's a number of them the number of households that are living just fine without broadband, despite my confusion as to how that happens, but that's what the data show. And in that framework, having universal service continued to be the voice service requirement and the other broadband obligation requirements, I think really move forward the federal universal service objectives. And I agree with Jonathan on the concept that broadband in the 2030s is not going to be 100 by 20. And so you have to essentially look at saying, okay, what networks are available that you can build now that have the scale and capability to grow into a larger broadband framework. And that's the goal for, I think, universal service.
Jonathan, you mentioned it's all about the definitions. So what changes would you propose, if any?
Again, I am a frequent critic of the FCC, but I'm also an admirer of the FCC's work. In my career, the FCC has changed the world, changed regulation through competitive spectrum auctions, something that Evan Querelle wrote about in 1982, that Congress required in 1993, and then the FCC implemented shortly thereafter. The move to implement the Telecommunications Act of 1996 required a series of proceedings, interconnection, number portability, things that were fundamental to require competition. The kind of competitive auctions for spectrum, the forward reverse auction, that is to get broadcasters to give up spectrum and then have wireless providers, mobile operators bid for that spectrum. Sort of a really genius. This was Nobel Prize winning economic kind of work. The FCC has done revolutionary work. I'm asking that it do something here similar. I'm not defining broadband. I have a definition of broadband, but I think the FCC should. I think the FCC is the only agency in the federal government, and certainly this is a federal, and we've given it all to the states now. It used to be considered a, it's inherently interstate service, but okay. The FCC is unique in the federal government. It's unique across the country. It has certain expertise and capability. I think it should, in a technology-neutral way. And if people don't understand what I'm saying, the definition the FCC came up with for broadband, 4.1 back in 2010, 2011, 4.1, 10.1 in 15, 25.3. Those are all technology accommodating. That's to allow DSL to participate, to meet the requirements. The 100 down, 20 up. Those are things to allow cable broadband and fixed wireless broadband to participate in various FCC proceedings. Those are technology accommodating. They don't have anything to do with technological neutrality. So I think the FCC should follow what everybody claims to want, technological neutrality, and define broadband for the future. If you're going to fund things for 15 years, then look out 15 years and say, here's what we need. Because in my time at the FCC, just in my time at the FCC, we had 8 different definitions of broadband. Yeah, 4.1, 10.1, 25.5, 25.3, 100 down, 20 up, gigabit down, 500 up. So none of those are mine, but it's not up to me. The FCC should be, look, I know you put out a broadband report to define broadband every year, and every year it's a political document. Do the real technical work. Define broadband really for the future, for the country, and then fund that. Fund Golden West, because they're the only ones that are building fiber in rural South Dakota. Fund them, absolutely. Look, nobody else is coming there to a two home per mile. Same is true in Nebraska. Same is true in Montana and parts of Texas, but it isn't true everywhere. But until you define it, then what Nick says, which is absolutely right, and what Douglas says is absolutely right, as long as you ignore Starlink and Kuiper, Leo, whatever that is. It's right until you look at those services. So if the commission decides to define broadband in a way in which Starlink meets the definition, man, I'll live with it. I don't have a problem. I'll disagree and live with it. I'll go back to my home in Colorado where I don't have fiber, where I don't have fixed wireless, where I don't have telephone, where I don't have Starlink either because the mountain interferes.
What would you propose doing with the voice requirement for USF?
I don't think there should be a voice requirement. Or I think there should be a voice requirement that recognizes you can get voice everywhere. You can get voice by satellite. You can get voice everywhere. So sure, there should be a voice requirement because it's a fundamental part of Section 254 and all. It says telecommunications, advanced telecommunications and information services, sure. And then you take the second step and say, is there voice in rural America? I'd say yes. They can deliver voice. I don't believe they can deliver broadband everywhere, they being the LEO, the low Earth orbiting satellites.
Nick, your thoughts on voice for high-cost USF?
Jonathan had some points regarding technology neutrality, and I do think that if there is a requirement, there shouldn't be a requirement that is tied to TDM technology. I think that's not a good approach. I think if an ETC provides reliable voice, including 911 services, it should satisfy the requirement, whether it's delivered over TDM or IP. So let's say from my perspective, I don't think it's the voice requirement as an obstacle to the IP transition. I do think that a voice requirement is important. There are cases in which coverage issues and otherwise, yes, you could get satellite service at the cost of satellite service and whatnot, and we're back to affordability. So I just think that from the perspective of the requirement, the commission making it, I'll say technology agnostic, maybe is a better word.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. The TDM voice speech, I wouldn't require you to switch.
I think it's a good time we have about 25 minutes left, and AJ Burton has some questions regarding costs and savings, specifically with regard to high-cost USF supporting the transition. AJ.
We've heard here and in other panels that moving voice traffic to IP imposes costs. I think we heard from Jonathan, he doesn't think there's a lot of costs associated with that. Doug, Nick, I know Jonathan said that way back at the beginning of the panel. Jonathan, forgive me if I'm misquoting you. Doug and Nick, can you talk about if moving voice to IP imposes real costs and how the commission should quantify those costs?
Yeah, let me give it a try.
I didn't say that the transition doesn't impose costs. It absolutely imposes costs. I'm saying let them deliver voice however they want to deliver voice. That's different. Okay. But of course, the requirements that you upgrade your network, you put in fiber, you get rid of your switch net. Yes, that imposes costs. That's not my point. My point is don't impose those costs. A TDM switch voice, I've been in the industry long enough. The voice quality is perfectly fine. Why switch to my thing? My thing being VoIP. I didn't transition from anything.
Awesome. Sorry to misquote you. Very helpful. Jonathan agrees there's real costs. How does the commission quantify those costs?
AJ, the costs, as far as the model goes for an IP transition, we heard today, earlier this morning, that Lumen, and I think the other larger carriers, I don't speak for them because I didn't hear them say this, but Lumen said that they don't want to be the hub anymore, the tandem provider. They want to get out of that business and not have subtending carriers off of their Class 4 tandems. So one of the key issues for moving to an IP framework is the transport issue, and it's related to the distance issue. Right now, rural carriers have a rural transport rule. That rule essentially says interconnecting carriers that want to exchange traffic with a rural carrier come to the rural area. And that rural transport rule allows the rural carrier to have a cost containment. They're responsible for the costs in their study area, their service area, but they do not have costs that extend beyond that. The IP transition has the potential to upset that by saying, no, the considerations of bill and keep is the originating carrier bills and keeps and is responsible for delivering the traffic to the endpoint, the terminating carrier's location. And in that case, the transport obligation now extends way beyond the rural carrier area. And so that extra cost is really what's concerning. And you heard about edge points, network edges, and so forth. All of that is related to extending the financial responsibility of the transport beyond the study area or beyond the service area of the rural carrier. So those are key elemental costs that are, in addition, that need to be addressed by the commission as to how that works. Now, that could go into a new Connect America Fund program or having CAF ICC form and be a situation where it's CAF ICC, CAF IP, whatever you want to call it. You had experience with that because when you moved to CAF BLS service, you actually took ICLS and CAF BLS and you merged those two programs together and called them CAF BLS. But the fundamental mechanism is that there needs to be a way to allow for the cost to be recovered. I do note that in the NPRM, there's a statement saying, okay, bill and keep is you charge your end user customer what you need in order to have your network. Then there's a footnote that says bill and keep is really, you charge your end user at an affordable rate, and then you use universal service to cover the rest. I would hope that footnote gets into the body so that you actually recognize that, yeah, universal service is integral, like I said, and what Jonathan repeated is that's the main thing. And so transport costs are very big until you identify those obligations during the transition and after the transition. Those obligations are the large item in the room.
That's very helpful. And how can we quantify those transport costs?
You can do a couple of things. One, there are data out there now. There are carriers that are using transmitters for IP service, rural carriers that are using like a Cinch or other transit providers for delivering IP to the tandems, to the PSTN. That information could be offered, or you could ask for it and see if it's available. There are other ways to model those costs because that information can be available. So there are ways to either do it empirically through data gathering and data collection or through modeling to find out what those costs would be for the distances that we're talking about.
And I don't mean to put you on the spot, and that can get you for sure, and happy to have you answer it if you prefer. But so IP is being transited to a point. Voice is much smaller bandwidth than all the internet traffic. How do we think about that incremental cost? Is that the wrong way to think about it?
That goes to the point, AJ, of as to whether the end result is the FCC is envisioning that you're using the internet as the only vehicle. All of the proposals that are available, I think the U.S. Telecom proposal and the other allied proposal allows for direct IP interconnection or alternatively through public internet framework. Prior panelists have discussed the concern for 911 going over the public internet, and the response from AT&T, if my recollection serves, was that, oh no, that would be a direct connect. And so there's going to be a variety of IP connections. It's not just going to be the pipe. I should also note that rural carriers, very distinct from the larger brethren in the room, largely have affiliates that are the ISPs. And their affiliates provide the broadband service. They provide a wholesale connection to the affiliate. And so you're talking about a structure where the person who's providing the voice service is not the person who actually has the IP pipe to the public internet.
So, Nick, how should the commission, say we're looking at a cost replacement fund, how should the commission measure those costs or show its work? What can we point to?
I think it's from a cost standpoint, it's cost aware. So you see these conversations going on throughout the last couple of days about POIs and points of interconnection. It ties on to what Douglas said regarding the cost change drastically if it's a local connection or if I got to haul it to Chicago. If I got to haul it to Chicago, how am I going to get it there? I can tell you as a rural provider, that is a non-trivial problem to solve. You don't have immediate access to middle mile networks like the big guys do. The big telcos, of course, IP interconnection works over their network. They are part of the core network. When you're on the leaf or you're on the edge of the network, trying to get to a place like Chicago is non-trivial. On top of that, coupled are the operating costs of, okay, so we haul it to Chicago. What happens if there's a problem? We have a term in the industry called finger pointing. And what happens is when the call runs through several carriers, because you're on the edge of it and you got to get it to Chicago, nobody wants to take ownership of that issue, especially maybe the larger you are. So to some degree, I think to define the cost, you need to define the POI. Where do you want it to be at? Is it going to be a specialized network? Obviously, we've advocated for one POI per state at least. Others and panels have advocated for, look, let's run this over the internet. It works. Of course it works because you're large. The smaller guys, we don't have that kind of access. We have to rely on affiliates, third parties to get us a middle mile network to make that work, which has costs. So until you define the POIs, make it, I'll say, a judgment to say, look, it's one POI per state, then I think everyone could come together and say, okay, the larger carriers are there. The smaller carriers, it's more reasonable to do because you're not having to transport this across the country. So it's a good middle ground approach versus routing over the internet. And the internet as a whole is a best effort network. Well, we've had years of high quality TDM based services because it is a private network. So we start putting that over the public internet without the appropriate standards and I'll say the jurisdiction to deal with issues when it doesn't work. That's a big problem for operators in rural America is what happens when things don't work on the internet. You get finger pointing and nobody wants to solve it. And if you think that doesn't happen, I would call to attention the rural call completion issues. When there isn't a framework in place that both the operators and the FCC can use to say this is how you should behave. And so I think the cost thing is factored into that from a quality, where do you want us to deliver it? Can, as an industry, both the large carriers and the small carriers come up with a way in which we can meet in the middle. And I think from that perspective, everything locks into place of, okay, this is what the costs are to get there. From there, you have, I'll say, different programs in place to work through that. And from there, then you can figure out whether it needs additional support or it fits within the broader USF mechanism and how that plays out.
Very helpful. We've also heard that moving voice to all IP reduces costs. If we're doing a cost replacement mechanism, should we be looking at savings on electricity, repairs, real estate if we're doing funding to make carriers whole? How should we quantify those savings? Nick, any thoughts on savings on the move to all IP? Is that something, can we quantify it and look at that as well?
Yeah, so I think there will be cost savings, certainly to the larger carriers that are decommissioning TDM legacy switching, without a doubt. Back to, again, at what expense? So if you're decommissioning, back to Douglas's point, a local tandem-based interconnection with a rural provider, great, big win for the large telcos. And then the rural telcos have to pick it up and haul that all the way to Chicago. So I think it's just a careful analysis of, yes, there's going to be cost savings for certainly the larger carriers. But as pointed out in prior comments from panels, rural providers are, 90% of us are already IP internally. So it's really that last piece of interconnection. So it's really how much more efficient can you make it from a rural provider in that last 15%? The existing universal service programs have helped us get there. We've already recognized a lot of that efficiency from a cost perspective. That's already been recognized. So you're talking about the last piece, which is the interconnection. So for rural providers, you don't see a lot of cost savings, frankly. I think you're going to see it in the larger carriers where they can decommission large tandems and haul things in a more effective way.
Doug, anything to add? Is there any cost savings?
No, I agree with Nick on the fact that the carriers that have already moved to IP have already realized those efficiencies. But the point is well taken, AJ, that you do need to show your work on cost savings and added costs. So that has to be part of the equation or part of the calculation, the algorithm, when you're looking at it. Because there may be some one-off situations where there might be a little bit more savings. So it should be part of the evaluation.
Thank you. Jonathan, yesterday we heard from the chairman, we're looking at an IP transition in the next couple of years. This is going to happen. Following up on your not live in the world that we're going to do the IP transition. What do you think about this discussion regarding costs and expense of delivering traffic in all IP? Your companies and the companies you work with, I believe, generally are already IP. Do you have comments here with respect to the discussion here? Does this one way or the other? These costs make sense? They don't make sense? The incremental costs with respect to IP traffic?
Look, it's going to happen. The sun's going to rise tomorrow. It's going to happen too. Government doesn't have to get involved in everything. Government doesn't have to get involved in the IP transition. Yeah, it's happening. It's been happening. My comment is just, I don't think it's necessary for government requirements to switch out voice systems that operate fine today. There's no particular benefit to voice over IP over a switched network. For those carriers that want to, I'm just saying remove the mandate. For those carriers that want to, sure, those geographic areas should undergo some kind of a competitive process every other program run by every other government agency, NTIA, Department of Agriculture, the Treasury Department overseeing everything else was competitive in rural America for the past 10 years. So, costs, benefits, sure, it's going to happen, but I narrow it. Not. The other thing, was ignoring is that the FCC used to be the only game in town for rural America, IP transition or otherwise, rural broadband, rural voice. It's not anymore. $42.45 billion appropriated to NTIA because Congress didn't want to give it to the FCC. Billions of dollars given to the Department of Agriculture. There's no consistency across these programs. All I'm saying is that maybe there's coordination, but there's no consistency across the government agencies. There's no definition of what you're trying to do. And there's no humility by the government as to what it should do and what it shouldn't do. I'm a big fan of the delete proceeding. The chairman that you mentioned, maybe ought to look at the various parts of this and see whether maybe some of them are no longer necessary because they've been overtaken by events or overtaken by other government agencies stepping on the FCC's patch.
Sort of two thoughts out of that. With respect to the IP transition, I think some of it is no longer enforcing the obligation to interconnect in TDM. So to the extent there's privately negotiated agreements, query whether that is or is not. But let's drill down on B just a bit. You mentioned $42.5 billion. You just wanted to offer the opportunity if anyone else wanted to speak to how we should be thinking about BEAD or not. Don't have to cover this on this panel. I'm sure we can cover it some on the next if that is preferred.
Can I talk about something else other than
Depends
BEAD?
what it is.
The issue of, you mentioned in your colloquy with Jonathan, the private negotiated agreements. It's a David and Goliath story. And the commission recognized this in a question in the NPRM saying, should we worry about transit providers and the ability of rural carriers to strike a fair deal with a large transit provider? And the answer is absolutely yes, you should be worried about that. Because it's the small guy going against a big guy, and it's going to be their way or the highway, and they will have really no leverage to make a reasonable agreement. And so in that framework, in that context, frameworks and guidelines and guideposts are really absolutely necessary for the commission to make sure that there is a fairness, an ability for a rural carrier to achieve what they would normally achieve under 251, 252 interconnection. But since we're talking about VoIP, and VoIP is not Title II, so therefore now we're talking about private contracts, there needs to be some guardrails on those arrangements, or the rural carriers are going to be severely disadvantaged.
Just a follow-up question on that. Is that true, David and Goliath's story? Is that equally true with respect to IP traffic exchange?
IP traffic exchange, yeah, I'm speaking in terms of the IP on the transport.
IP data vis-a-vis IP voice.
IP data. Nick, you might have better information on whether you're getting
Yeah, I think, I'll say the current regulatory regime does require that people play nice, if you will. I think, again, it is a real David and Goliath thing when you're talking about internet traffic because there is no leverage. And when you get to a point as a small carrier and things don't work, calls don't get transported, and you talk to your upstream, who in turn talks to an upstream, who in turn talks to an upstream. Every escalation point above that, you lose less ability to even figure out what's going on. There's definitely something from a service quality standpoint. I think the commission could say whether it's a private agreement or folks opt to route it over the internet. Look, here's the standards. Here's what the quality standards are. Because if you don't have a standard benchmark for people to compare against, then there is no reason for a large carrier to listen to a small carrier when there's a problem. It's a rounding error as far as traffic volume goes for them. And look, it's not worth their time to fix it. So private agreements allow you to highlight those in forms of SLAs. So that is helpful. But one of the biggest concerns the rural industry has about just running this over the internet is this issue. So what happens when it doesn't work? You're trying to work with large carriers who have no interest in listening to small carriers, problems because it just doesn't financially make sense for them. And I get it. I'm not arguing with that. But at the end of the line, when we're talking about universal service, quality is a big component of that as well. And so for me, as my 10-year-old daughter would say, it's very sketchy to maybe consider that the internet will just solve it all, because I don't think there's a good framework for when things don't work. There are standards, there's traffic that routes, but there have not been set up. I know there's groups working on it from a standards standpoint, but you could create a really bad situation for rural to large carrier negotiations by making sure that the deck is stacked. And I think that's very important to consider from a commission standpoint.
Thanks, Nick. We heard on the panel just before this that NTCA has proposed restructuring CAF ICC as a new IP transition fund in response to the commission proposing phasing out CAF ICC. I'd love folks' thoughts on this, if any, if folks care to comment on that in particular. Nick, maybe start with you, as I believe you're an NTCA member.
Yeah, we're an NTCA member. Look, CAF ICC is very important. So really, that's my main concern about CAF ICC phase out is really timing. I think we need to have a clear and concise way from a framework standpoint where the commission can say, here's what the process will look like and here's the time frame. I think the time frames proposed of a couple years is unrealistic, both from standards, from a revenue replacement, from a cost management, when there's a lot of factors unknown. Obviously, you've heard from other rural providers that some of the time frames regarding like the U.S. Telecom proposal, obviously those are things that rural companies can get behind from a timing. You can manage that, just like with the other programs for universal service. It gives us a predictable way to manage a difficult transition. And doing that in 2 years is not predictable. We're making investments. Many of us have loans against that, and it's very difficult to spin this in 2 years. And even you couple that with bill and keep under the access charges going away, and you're going to create a situation that could really negatively impact rural America. Obviously, we support programs that are longer like that, or proposals that are longer like that, because it gives us the level of predictability that we need to plan around both the costs and the revenue disappearing.
I have not heard the case yet as to why the existing phase down of CAF ICC, because that's what we're in from 2011, we have a phase down already. I have not heard the case to say why we need to accelerate that. That case has not been made. I think the parties in the previous panel have assumed that it goes to eternity. It's indefinite as far as its termination. The FCC in 2011 in the transformation order actually established a phase down. Yes, a long phase down, but it still was a phase down. As far as working it, and I just need to mention on the incentives, so there was a discussion about incentives, of whether there was a disincentive to move to IP when you had CAF ICC. My view is, I don't know how you can have a disincentive with the CAF ICC is already established. It was frozen. The revenue requirement that was used to establish CAF IC was a frozen amount in 2012. You don't get any additional money if you go out and buy a TDM switch now. You don't get any additional money if you go out and buy an IP switch now as well. It's a frozen amount that's being phased down, it's being gradually phased out. Carriers are using CAF ICC to actually buy and actually put into place IP networks. That universal service money is fungible. And so when you get CAF ICC, you can use that money for network improvement.
So I think one follow-on question we have is, folks have talked a little bit about high-cost funding with respect. It's a dollar question. You've heard it on this panel here, on the panel before this. I do want to talk about our existing funding mechanisms and the extent to which they do facilitate and support delivering voice and IP. And the case may be it's just the previous programs haven't done anything with respect to that, or they may. Nick, your company's an EACAM participant. Does that program help facilitate the transition to IP?
Oh, absolutely. It has, and it continues to. So I think programs like the high-cost loop programs with both ACAM2 and Enhanced ACAM, we're an Enhanced ACAM company, but before that we were an ACAM2 company. It gives us that predictability I talked about. It gives us the confidence as a company to go take out loans, to buy switching equipment, to move the network forward to that. So I think in general, it has moved the cause forward in rural America, because if it wasn't there, there would be no IP switching at all. But as talked about earlier, 90% of rural companies within the NTCA's membership already has IP all the way to the edge. Well, how did they do that? They did it through these programs. They did it through the programs, on top of the fact of deploying fiber out there, in Jonathan's case, and really making a difference in rural America. They also use that to advance technology, including switching all the way up to the edge. So really, we're on the last piece of this, and the question is, how do we get past that? And that's, I think, the last few days have talked about.
Other comments before we wrap it up?
Just one on that. I'm a rural carrier too. Only rural. Don't build into any cities. Don't build into any towns. Build to the places that rural electric co-ops were permitted to build to in the 1930s and 1940s. That is real rural. We don't even get the benefit of small towns that some of the rural telcos got to build to because the rural electric co-ops weren't. The problem I have in all the discussion, I'm not going to criticize the NTCA proposal, but it's that you've divided rural carriers into rural carriers that get money and rural carriers that don't. Rural carriers that get money because of their history, because they've been defined as an incumbent. Man, cut me in. It's inequitable. It's anti-competitive. That is, I'm competing with rural carriers who get these funds too. I don't. So I make the same point. We invested money. I invested my own money. We participated in every government program there was where we were permitted to. Don't create a special category because of history. Let us participate too. You want to come up with some kind of a extension of, I've been around this town and around this industry for 40 years. A lot of what happens is just these isolated groups asking for their piece of the pie. I think the FCC needs to take a step back. What I said before, needs to define things. Needs to define things so that it can determine the role of LEO satellites. Needs to define things in terms of the existence of voice and whether you consider various other ways to deliver voice to be adequate. Needs to allow carriers like NICS in areas where there isn't going to be competition to have sufficient funds so that it can deliver to rural American households and businesses the type of services that are available in urban and suburban America. That is the core to universal service. It includes broadband. Stop defining it in a way where rural America is going to be left behind again, because that's what has happened in the BEAD program. In the BEAD program, not your program, but the BEAD program has interfered with your programs. The BEAD program, by defining things differently than you do, has interfered with the deployment of fiber networks in rural America. You're going to have to step back up, the FCC is, after the BEAD program is done. So make sufficient funds available in South Dakota for companies like NICS, where there isn't going to be competition. But make sure this is at one point, I've said a lot of shit, at one point, which is that broadband needs to be defined to be future-looking. It sure ain't 100 down, 20 up. And once you do that, then proceed from there in a technologically neutral fashion as to what can meet those standards and provide funding mechanisms, not for a transition, not from one thing to another, not from whatever, something caterpillar to a butterfly. No, just so that you're going to hit your target in the future. Aim high so that you can hit your target. Because it starts with, what are you aiming for? Just talking about a transition from TD and voice to voice over IP, it's just not, it's not adequate to what Nick's company has been doing for years and what my company and others like mine have been doing. We're trying to get rural America built out so that it has the same levels of service that are available everywhere. That's what the electric co-ops did. but it's better. You get electric service everywhere in rural America, except at lower prices and higher customer satisfaction and better maintained networks. So,
Thank you, Jonathan. Jeff, Nick, Doug, anything in closing you want us to be sure to remember?
Just thank you for this discussion. Been very good discussion, and thank you for allowing me to participate. And we'll be looking forward to further discussions on these matters.
Definitely.
Yeah, thanks, AJ, Scott, Commission, for allowing us to participate and get our viewpoints out. Really, I think we can all work together, whether you're a small carrier, large carrier, intermediate carrier, whatever you want to call it, to navigate this kind of complex issue, get a clear framework in place and a roadmap for IP interconnection and routing, cost responsibility, and recovery, and at the same time making sure that all Americans get the same level of service. Thank you.
I would just add that from NECA's perspective and what we've heard on 6 panels prior to ours, the IP transition is already underway, is already being deployed out in rural America. And what we've talked about here somewhat is the key policy question, maybe how universal service should evolve with it. Rural consumers still need a reliable voice broadband, 911, regardless of the technology that's being deployed. NECA's members are investing in next-gen networks, supported in part by federal support mechanisms that make deployment possible in high-cost areas, but rural carriers still face an uphill battle in terms of costs and moving to the IP transition. I think Nick and Douglas have made pretty strong points about the costs for transport and the pieces that go with it. And we hope that the technology may change, but the universal service mission, as Jonathan was mentioned, really remains the same and should be highlighted.
Thanks, Jeff. And go ahead, Jonathan.
no, thank you for inviting me. Always great to come home.
It was our pleasure. Thanks to all of you for a great discussion. Let's please give our panelists a round of applause.